I never thought I'd find myself walking towards that bridge, the weight of the court's decision heavy on my shoulders. The restaurant I'd poured my heart and soul into was gone, just like that. As I walked, the sound of a child crying in a dark alley sent shivers down my spine, a haunting reminder of life's fragility. It took me back to earlier that day, when I was still in my element, moving through the restaurant I managed, adjusting table settings with the practiced ease of someone who truly cared. I could feel the warmth of the polished wood beneath my fingers, smell the enticing aromas wafting from the kitchen. The last patrons were finishing their meals, their satisfied murmurs a testament to our hard work. But even then, a storm was brewing. My brother Jason, my co-manager, was already at the counter, his eyes fixed on the day's earnings. I could see the hunger for profit in his gaze, barely concealed and all-consuming. It was like looking at a stranger wearing my brother's face. Jason's voice cut through my reverie, sharp and unyielding. He told me I needed to understand that not everyone had the luxury of prioritizing perfection over profit. His words felt like a slap, each syllable dripping with disdain for the values we'd been raised with. I watched his hands, never leaving the stack of bills, as he continued his tirade. He reminded me that while we were in the business of providing meals, we were also here to make money. The implication was clear: if that meant tweaking recipes to cut costs, so be it. I couldn't help the heavy sigh that escaped me, my emotions swirling like a tempest inside. I felt torn between family loyalty and the principles I held dear. With a voice that sounded stronger than I felt, I confronted him. I told Jason that this wasn't just a small adjustment, he was compromising the quality of our food. The words tasted bitter in my mouth as I reminded him that this went against everything our parents had taught us about honesty and fairness. I could still hear Mom's voice in my head, telling us that integrity was the secret ingredient in every dish. Jason's dry laugh felt like sandpaper on my nerves. He accused me of always being right, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Then he brought up Dad, calling him a dreamer. The pain in my chest was almost physical as Jason asked where that dreaming had led our father. His words painted a cruel picture, exhausted and debt-ridden when he died. I wanted to scream, to defend the memory of the man who'd taught us to love cooking, but Jason wasn't finished. He declared that he wouldn't follow in our father's footsteps. We needed to be smarter to survive in this business, he said.
As Aaliyah left to finish preparations for the next day, Jason remained in the restaurant to take care of the final cleanup of the night. After the employees had gone home, Jason quickly surveyed the kitchen and began preparing sauces for the following day. He added water and swiftly shook the containers, as if performing a routine he had done countless times before. He checked each pot and pan, ensuring everything adhered to his cost-cutting instructions. "Look here, Hannah, this is how business is done," Jason explained. "We add a little water here, reduce the meat there, and our costs drop dramatically. The customers are still happy and continue to dine here, while our pockets keep getting fuller. We can't afford to spend money on unnecessary things, or we'll have to cut employee wages." Hannah, the chef, watched him with a mix of remorse and discontent evident on her face. Though tired, Hannah spoke up with determination. "Jason, I understand the need to cut costs," she said. "But we're sacrificing not just the quality of our food, but also the reputation of the restaurant. Customers will start to notice, and once we lose their trust, it's almost impossible to regain it." Jason fixed Hannah with a stern gaze. "Then make sure they don't notice," he said sharply. "This is an order, not a suggestion. You and the other chefs are hired to produce perfect dishes no matter the circumstances. Don't forget that sometimes sacrifices are necessary for the sake of the restaurant." Jason remained alone in the darkened restaurant, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He couldn't fathom why anyone would say his actions were wrong. In his mind, everything he did was for the betterment of the restaurant. He believed he was pushing it to grow even more than their parents had. Jason acknowledged that Aaliyah might be the legal owner on paper. However, he didn't think that guaranteed she bore more responsibility for its success than he did.
As I returned home that night, exhausted from work and weighed down by unresolved tension, Jason's final words still rang in my ears like a discordant bell. I slipped off my shoes, replacing them with the comfort of my well-worn slippers, and sank into the living room sofa. The quiet of my home was a stark contrast to the bustling noise of the restaurant, almost jarring in its peacefulness. As I sat there, thoughts of the restaurant's uncertain future and my fractured relationship with Jason pressed down on my heart like a heavy quilt. My mind drifted back to our childhood, and I could almost smell Mom's cooking as we played in the kitchen. A bittersweet smile tugged at my lips as I remembered those innocent days. Jason was always the little trickster, wasn't he? But even his pranks had a sense of fairness about them. I couldn't help but wonder, where did that part of him go? It was like watching a flower wilt and fast forward, seeing how my brother had transformed from that playful child into a man consumed by greed. The heaviness in my chest felt almost unbearable, but I knew in my bones that something had to change. I couldn't allow our restaurant, the legacy our parents had poured their hearts into, to be tarnished by actions they would never have condoned. Their voices seemed to whisper in my ear, reminding me of the lessons they'd instilled in us, that honor should always come before easy profit. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, my voice filled with determination. I needed to talk to Jason, to remind him of who we truly were at our core. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to make amends, to find his way back to the brother I once knew. As I sat there in the quiet of the night, I felt a glimmer of hope spark within me, fragile but persistent.
Meanwhile, at Jason's house, a completely different atmosphere prevailed. Jason sat on the edge of his bed, surrounded by scattered papers, spreadsheets, and future cost-cutting plans. His 8-year-old son, Christopher, shyly entered the room with a drawing he had made at school. Christopher, his eyes shining with pride, held out a crumpled piece of paper to his father. He explained that his teacher had instructed them to draw something precious to their family, something unbreakable that binds them together. However, Jason's face was etched with daily fatigue and irritation, barely glancing at the drawing. He coldly replied to Christopher, his voice tinged with impatience, telling him that now wasn't a good time and that kids come last. Christopher, with the innocence of his young age, persisted, wanting just a little of his father's attention. He pleaded with Jason, telling him that he had made this especially for him and that he had even drawn their restaurant in the picture. Christopher's voice trembled, a mix of sadness and rejection evident in his tone. Jason sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, responding more out of exhaustion than interest. His voice dripped with clear disdain as he told Christopher to leave it there and that he'd look at it later. He then dismissed his son, telling him to go play or do something else because he had work to do. Christopher left the room, still clutching his drawing, the light in his eyes gradually fading. He could feel the shadow of disappointment growing day by day in his heart. In his young mind, Christopher was beginning to understand that his workaholic father was no longer his hero. Hours passed, and morning arrived at Jason's house. However, instead of a hopeful new day, there was only the certainty of another day filled with tension and trouble. The soft morning light barely illuminated Christopher's room. Christopher woke up, haunted by the previous night's dreams, having overslept well past his usual wake-up time. Jason, already late for work, felt anger surge in his chest when he noticed Christopher wasn't in the kitchen. He shouted up the stairs, his voice filled with anger, asking Christopher why he couldn't just wake up on time. Each word was laced with uncontrollable irritation. Little Christopher, still rubbing his sleepy eyes, was confused by his father's harsh gaze, words, and actions. He apologized, saying he somehow didn't hear his alarm, his hands shaking as he tried to button his shirt. Jason raised his voice, telling Christopher that wasn't good enough and that he'd have to take him to school and explain why they were late. He berated his son for wasting his valuable time he could have used to solve problems at work. Jason dragged Christopher out of the house and into the car. The drive to school was filled with tense silence. Jason explained harshly to Christopher how he should behave and the importance of punctuality. Christopher huddled in his seat, feeling the weight of disappointing his father as he accepted the scolding. It was a feeling that was becoming all too familiar day by day.
I arrived at the restaurant that morning, my mind swirling with worries and plans like a tornado in my head. As I approached the entrance, I saw Hannah had already arrived and was organizing the kitchen tools for lunch prep. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation ahead, knowing it could dramatically alter our future. My heart was heavy as I walked towards Hannah, the weight of my concerns almost physical. I started speaking to her in a serious tone, my voice barely above a whisper. I told her I'd been thinking a lot about the situation with Jason and how it was affecting our restaurant. I confided in her that Jason's methods were impacting not just the quality of our food, but also the morale of our staff. I admitted I was seriously considering making big changes, my voice trembling slightly with the gravity of the situation. Hannah listened intently, her face mirroring the weight of my words. She agreed, her eyes filled with a sadness that matched my own. She expressed how painful it was to watch this beloved place change, and how it was affecting everyone there. Her question about my plans hung in the air, heavy with concern for the restaurant and all its employees. I paused, carefully choosing my words before I responded. I told her I planned to talk to Jason, to make him see the impact of his decisions. My voice cracked a little as I added that if that didn't work, it might be time to distance him from the business, for everyone's sake. I couldn't hide the pain and conflict on my face as I admitted how difficult this decision was, given that Jason was my brother. Hannah nodded understandingly, her gesture full of empathy and support. She assured me of her backing, promising to help maintain the restaurant's quality and respect, no matter what I decided. Her solidarity provided a small comfort, like a warm blanket on a cold night. Suddenly, the door slammed shut louder than usual, and Jason stormed in, his face a storm cloud of frustration. The tension he brought was palpable, like a sudden change in air pressure before a thunderstorm. He barked at Hannah to get back to work, his voice rough and impatient. Hannah nodded silently, throwing me a worried glance before returning to her tasks. I approached Jason cautiously, choosing my words carefully. I asked him if something else had happened, besides being a little late that morning. I tried to soften the tension he brought in, my voice gentle and concerned. Jason sighed heavily, running his hand through his hair as he responded. He told me about having to drive Christopher to school because he was late, his voice dripping with irritation. He complained that his son had no sense of responsibility or punctuality, and how it was affecting everything, including his work. I could see the fatigue behind his anger, the morning's events clearly having taken their toll. As I stood there, caught between my brother's frustration and the needs of our restaurant, I felt the weight of my impending decision more heavily than ever. I looked at my brother, my face a mix of concern and reproach. I reminded him gently that Christopher was still a child, suggesting that we might need to find a better way to teach him responsibility, one that wouldn't affect either of them so negatively. But Jason brushed off my suggestion with a wave of his hand, his frustration palpable in the air between us. He told me it wasn't just about Christopher, his voice taking on a more serious tone as he mentioned the restaurant's costs. My heart sank as he began outlining his plans before I could even formulate a response. His words hit me like a punch to the gut as he talked about cutting fresh ingredients by half and replacing them with cheaper, longer-lasting frozen alternatives. He even mentioned cutting back on employee overtime, expecting them to become more efficient within regular hours. I felt a chill run down my spine at Jason's words, my mind racing with the implications of his plan. I tried to reason with him, my voice barely above a whisper as I explained how this would lower the quality of our food. I reminded him that our customers came to us expecting quality, and we couldn't maintain that with so many frozen ingredients. But Jason, his eyes cold and determined, pushed on relentlessly. He called it a necessary risk, his voice harsh as he declared that profit, not the opinions of a few unsatisfied customers, was what kept the restaurant going. I watched in horror as Jason strode to the center of the kitchen, his instructions cutting through the air like a sharp knife. He ordered the chefs to have the pie fillings and use more crust, his voice brooking no argument. The chefs, gathered near the ovens, noted these changes with tense expressions, their shoulders visibly slumping with each new instruction. I stood near the kitchen entrance, a silent witness to this upheaval. My heart ached as I saw the hesitation in the staff's eyes, yet none dared to question the orders aloud. They understood all too well the consequences of opposing their boss at this crucial time. As Jason moved to the counter to check ingredients, I followed him, my feet feeling as heavy as my heart. We passed tables set for lunch, each with its crisp tablecloth and polished cutlery, a poignant reminder of the quality we'd always strived for. I stood beside him, waiting for a lull in his work before I spoke. My voice was low, trying to keep our conversation private as I asked if he'd considered how these changes might affect our regular customers' reactions. Jason, still counting canned tomatoes, didn't even look up as he responded. His words about focusing on numbers and customers not noticing if we did it right sent a wave of unease through me. I bit my lip, worried about his confidence and apparent disregard for the restaurant's reputation. Looking around, I noticed the staff watching our interaction covertly, their faces mirroring my own concern. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as molasses, as the staff watched us with bated breath. Jason was lost in his calculations and cost-cutting measures, but I knew I had to act. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I approached him and grasped his arm firmly yet carefully. My voice was steady as I told him we needed to talk in my office right away. Jason's surprise at my interruption was evident, his irritation bubbling to the surface as he protested that we were in the middle of work. I could hear the displeasure in his voice, but I stood my ground. As I led Jason to the office at the back of the restaurant, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. A whirlwind of determination and anxiety coursed through my veins. I knew this conversation could change everything, yet doubt still lingered in the corners of my mind. Am I doing the right thing? I wondered, my hand trembling slightly as I opened the office door. As the door closed behind us, I took a deep breath, drawing strength from the legacy and memories of our parents. My voice quivered a bit as I reminded Jason that we were co-managers and that I was also the owner of the restaurant. I told him firmly that I wouldn't allow his rash decisions to ruin our establishment. Jason's anger was palpable as he retorted that I didn't understand business. He claimed he was doing what was necessary to keep us at the top, accusing me of being too emotional. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as I contradicted him, telling him that he was endangering our reputation and the quality of cuisine our parents had built. With a heavy heart but a resolute demeanor, I informed him that he was no longer a co-manager of the restaurant. Jason's bitter laugh and his expression of anger and disbelief cut through me like a knife. He questioned if I really thought I could force him out, insisting he wouldn't leave and that I couldn't run the place without him. I had anticipated his resistance and was prepared. I told him I had all the paperwork ready, explaining that his actions and decisions were harming the business. I informed him that I would be taking full control and warned him about the consequences of legal resistance. As I mentioned the large check I had to buy out his share, I could see Jason's demeanor change. He understood the implications of opposing me further. Though I could see the anger boiling inside him, he finally relented. His parting words, filled with hatred, echoed in the room as he predicted my failure and insisted I'd be begging for his return within 2 weeks. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the room like Jason's final blow. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart still racing from the confrontation. My eyes fell on the desk, scattered with papers detailing Jason's dismissal, tangible evidence of the painful decision I had just made. I tried to reassure myself, repeating in my mind, I did what needed to be done. But deep down, I knew the impact of my decision on Jason could be profound and long-lasting. It felt like I had just cut off a limb to save the body, and the phantom pain was almost unbearable. Just then, the door opened quietly, and Hannah entered. Her face was etched with concern, mirroring the tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. She approached me cautiously, asking if I was okay. She mentioned that everyone had heard the shouting and seen Jason storming out in a rage. I sighed deeply, feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders at Hannah's presence. With a trembling voice, I explained that I had to make a difficult decision. I told her that Jason was no longer a co-manager of the restaurant because his actions were jeopardizing everything, and I couldn't let it continue. The words felt strange on my tongue, as if I was hearing someone else say them. Hannah sat next to me, offering silent support that felt like a warm embrace. She questioned why I seemed so down about the decision, reminding me that I had been saying for a while that things needed to change, As I looked at Hannah, my eyes must have reflected the complex emotions swirling inside me. I admitted that while it was a necessary change, I knew Jason well. He wasn't the type to let things end easily, and I expressed my hope that we could get through this without further chaos. The uncertainty in my voice was palpable, like a ship setting sail into fog-shrouded waters.
Meanwhile, Jason returned home, still seething with anger from the confrontation at the restaurant. His heart was filled with sparks of hatred and resentment. He forcefully pushed open the door, his eyes immediately falling on Christopher, who was sitting on the couch working on his school homework. Christopher was completely oblivious to the emotional storm his father was carrying. Jason snapped at Christopher in a sharp, harsh tone, demanding to know how many times he had to tell him not to leave the room so messy when he came home. The books and notebooks scattered on the couch seemed like a personal challenge to the order Jason craved. Christopher, with a frightened face, tried to explain that he was just doing the homework his teacher had assigned. He said he was trying hard to finish it, but it was very difficult, so he had spread out his drafts hoping it might help. Jason cut him off, telling Christopher to be quiet and that his sloppiness and laziness were unacceptable. He called Christopher an incompetent child, moving forward to grab a book and throw it on the floor. Jason's words were sharp, cutting through what little sense of security Christopher might have felt. Christopher huddled on the couch, wishing he could make himself as small and invisible as possible. He squeezed out an apology, promising to try harder while holding back tears. Jason continued, spitting out each word of contempt, telling Christopher he always said that but never changed. He asked if Christopher understood how much he was interfering with Jason's work, insisting that everything he did was for their livelihood and that Christopher was just creating more problems. Jason took a deep breath, his anger still not subsiding. He ordered Christopher to clean up the messy room immediately and then be quiet, saying he needed to think and couldn't do so with Christopher's crying. Christopher hurriedly began to clean up the books, his hands shaking. He didn't look up at his father again, afraid of provoking more anger. As he tidied up, his father's words echoed in his mind, each one deepening the pain and fear. Jason left Christopher in the living room and retreated to his office, a place where he kept important documents and made phone calls he didn't want others to hear. Sitting messily at his desk, his mind was filled with plans for revenge against Aaliyah. He understood that attacking the restaurant would hurt Aaliyah the most. For several minutes, Jason stewed in his anger, his thoughts racing. Finally, he made the decision to anonymously report the restaurant to the health department, anticipating the damage it would do to the establishment's reputation and, by extension, to his sister. With grim determination, he dialed the number, his fingers steady and purposeful. Each press of a key seemed to solidify his resolve. When the call connected, Jason adopted a concerned yet detached manner, posing as a customer who had accidentally witnessed health code violations. He began speaking in a trembling voice, feigning worry as he said he wanted to report a serious concern about a restaurant in town. On the other end of the line, Carolyn Ferris, the local health department supervisor, answered in a calm, businesslike tone. She introduced herself and asked how she could help, ready to take notes on any potential violations. Jason continued with his report, claiming there were serious hygiene issues at the restaurant and very suspicious practices being used. He insisted that an inspection should be conducted immediately. To ensure there was no misunderstanding, he clearly stated that the restaurant in question was the well-known establishment on Flores Street, owned by Aaliyah Gomez. Carolyn acknowledged the seriousness of the situation and assured Jason that she would arrange for an immediate inspection. She thanked him for his report. Her efficient response gave Jason an impending sense of satisfaction.
I remember that day as if it were yesterday, the day our world came crashing down around us. We were going about our usual routine in the restaurant when suddenly, Carolyn Ferris from the health department walked in with 2 assistants. The air in the room seemed to thicken as they entered, their authoritative presence impossible to ignore. My heart skipped a beat when Carolyn introduced herself and announced they were here for an immediate inspection due to a report they'd received. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as she asked all our customers to leave for safety reasons. I approached her, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked what specifically had been reported. I assured her we always paid strict attention to hygiene standards and hadn't had any major issues recently. But even as I spoke, I could feel a knot of dread forming in the pit of my stomach. Carolyn nodded, promising to explain soon, and began the inspection. I watched, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, as she and her team meticulously checked every nook and cranny of our kitchen. Each note they made felt like a potential nail in our coffin. The silence that fell after the inspection was deafening. Hannah and I stood there, tension radiating from every pore, as we waited for Carolyn's verdict. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like physical blows. She told us what they'd found was shocking: signs of cross-contamination, chaotic storage methods violating all food safety standards, unauthorized cleaning products near food. Each revelation felt like a knife twisting in my gut. But she wasn't done. She continued, detailing the uneven meat sizes, watered-down sauces, poorly maintained kitchen equipment. I felt the color drain from my face as the full extent of the violations became clear. My hands were shaking as I tried to process the magnitude of what this inspection had uncovered. I could see Hannah, bless her heart, trying to explain that this was all Jason's doing, his cost-cutting measures, his negligence, even his disregard for labor laws. But as Carolyn's eyebrows shot up at the mention of labor violations, I knew we were in even deeper trouble than I'd first thought. I felt my world crumbling as Carolyn's voice, filled with obvious disapproval, pronounced that the situation was extremely serious. She stated that employee abuse only made things worse, and I could feel the weight of her words crushing me. When Carolyn's eyes met mine, I couldn't hold her gaze. The shock of Jason's actions being exposed left me speechless and ashamed. Her next words hit me like a ton of bricks. She acknowledged that many of these decisions were made by my former co-manager, but reminded me that as the current owner and person in charge, the ultimate responsibility was mine. The burden of ensuring the restaurant operated in compliance with legal and safety standards was my duty, and I had failed. After what felt like an eternity of heavy silence, Carolyn delivered her final judgment. My heart sank as she declared the permanent closure of our establishment, citing the severity of the violations. She explained that we couldn't attempt to reopen until all issues were satisfactorily resolved and we passed a new inspection. The alternative, she warned, would be legal action and substantial fines. As Carolyn's words echoed in my mind, I found myself alone in the office, lost in deep contemplation. The question, "How did I let this happen?" kept repeating in my head like a broken record. I replayed every decision, every sign I should have noticed earlier. The guilt of turning a blind eye to Jason's harmful actions and their impact on the restaurant's future was eating me alive. The reality of losing the restaurant, our family's legacy, hit me hard. I thought about the employees and their families who depended on this place for their livelihoods. What can I do for them now? I wondered, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I desperately searched my mind for ways to mitigate the impact of this devastating decision, but solutions seemed as elusive as smoke in the wind.
Meanwhile, tension was thick in Jason's house. Christopher, who usually kept his distance from adult troubles, had accidentally overheard his father's phone call to the health department. In his childlike innocence, Christopher easily sensed the gravity of Jason's actions. After a long silence, Christopher mustered the courage to approach his father, who was drinking alone in a dark room. Only the flickering light from the TV illuminated Jason's face. Christopher's voice trembled but was determined as he asked his father why he had reported his aunt's restaurant. His wide, questioning eyes were fixed on his father, feeling that this was far from how families should treat each other. Jason was startled by the question, and even more surprised that it came from his son. Anger and paranoid emotions welled up in his chest. He stared at Christopher, feeling as if his own son was a stranger. Jason's voice was aggressive, revealing his emotions were on the brink of collapse as he asked if Christopher was against him too. Christopher persisted, saying he just didn't understand, reminding his father how kind his aunt had always been to them. Jason stood up violently, the chair falling behind him with a loud crash. He shouted at Christopher, telling him to shut up, that he was just a child who understood nothing about life or business. He yelled that if Christopher wasn't on his side, he had no right to be there. Without further explanation, Jason grabbed Christopher's arm and dragged him towards the door. He ordered Christopher to get in the car, his tone leaving no room for questions or protests. Christopher, frightened and confused, obeyed his father and got into the car. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he refused to cry. Silence filled the car, broken only by the engine's hum and Jason's heavy breathing. Christopher stared out the window, trying to guess where they were going, his heart racing with fear of the unknown. Finally, Jason stopped the car in a dark alley near a bridge. The spot was secluded, with only the faint sound of a river in the distance. Jason turned to his son, staring into his eyes as he told Christopher to listen carefully. He said if Christopher hated him too, if he couldn't obey and stand by him, then he was no longer his son. Before Christopher could respond, Jason opened the passenger door and ordered him to get out. He practically pushed Christopher out of the car. Christopher stumbled out, not fully comprehending what was happening. Jason's last words were that Christopher shouldn't come home until he was ready to obey him. Then Jason accelerated, disappearing into the night, leaving Christopher alone in the cold, gloomy alley. As Jason drove home, the silence in the car amplified the turmoil in his mind. His thoughts naturally drifted to his deceased wife as the road stretched before him. The memory of her death during Christopher's birth always brought sharp pain, the pain of lost love and unshakable guilt. Jason wondered what she would have done, picturing her sad smile. It was his most cherished yet most painful memory. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his anger towards Christopher boiling inside him. Christopher was the indirect cause of his wife's death. Jason thought maybe it was better for Christopher to be gone for a while, but his heart felt heavy at the decision to abandon his son. He felt suffocated and wanted to breathe, to forget if possible. The idea of running away from the city and all its problems began to seem like the only solution in his confused mind.
As Hannah and I sat in the empty restaurant after closing, I couldn't help but marvel at how differently we were handling the gravity of our situation. Hannah, ever the practical one, was already trying to find the silver lining. She smiled, though I could see the effort it took, and said this would at least give her more time to visit her son. I watched her, amazed at her strength and resilience as she spoke about balancing work and motherhood. How did she do it so well? I wondered aloud, my voice a mix of admiration and doubt. I confessed that I couldn't imagine juggling a job and caring for a child. Hannah's gentle laugh cut through the heavy atmosphere like a warm breeze on a chilly day. She told me that mothers learn to do it all simultaneously, without panicking. It's all about balance, she said, and I could hear the wisdom of experience in her words. Her honesty about struggling some days touched me deeply. Our conversation stirred something in me, a long-buried desire I'd barely allowed myself to consider. I found myself sharing a secret dream with Hannah, that I'd always wanted to raise a child. As the words left my mouth, I felt a softness creep into my expression. I explained that I'd even considered adoption, but the restaurant had always seemed to leave no time for such dreams. Hannah's supportive smile warmed my heart as she suggested that perhaps now was the perfect time. With the restaurant closed, she reminded me I had uninterrupted time, and there were plenty of children needing homes. I felt a bittersweet smile form on my lips as I whispered that maybe she was right. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life, one where I was more than just a restaurant owner, where I might become a mother. Hannah's parting words echoed in my mind as we said our goodbyes. Now you have time for yourself, Aaliyah, for all the things you've always wanted to do. As I locked up the restaurant for what felt like the last time, the night had deepened, and the street was a canvas of shadows and weak lamplight. I began the short walk home, breathing in the cold night air, hoping it would clear my head. But as I neared the bridge, an unexpected sound broke the silence. It was the faint cry of a child, coming from a dark alley. I felt my heart racing as I heard that faint cry. Who could be crying in a place like this at this hour? I wondered, a mix of concern and fear coursing through me. Cautiously, I made my way into the alley, the sound of sobbing growing clearer with each step. As I approached the flickering shadows on the wall, the dim light barely illuminated a small figure huddled against the cold alley wall. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I recognized him instantly. It was Christopher. I crouched down beside him, my voice filled with worry as I asked him what had happened and why he was alone here. Christopher looked up at me, his eyes meeting mine as he choked back sobs. "Aunt Aaliyah," he began, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. He told me that his father had left him there, telling him not to come home unless he was ready to obey. Each word felt heavy, laden with his sadness and confusion. Then he dropped the bombshell: he'd seen his father report the restaurant. I felt myself recoil slightly at his words. Jason did that? He reported the restaurant and abandoned his own son? I thought, my mind reeling as it tried to process this information. Without hesitation, I reached out my hand to Christopher. "Come with me, Christopher. You're safe now," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. As we walked to my house, Christopher's small hand gripped mine tightly, clinging to the security I offered. Along the way, he told me about his father leaving without saying where he was going, only that he needed time and space. As dawn approached, I felt lost and overwhelmed. I decided to call Hannah for advice. "Hannah, please, can you come over right away? It's important. I need help," I pleaded when she answered. When Hannah arrived a short while later, I saw the shock on her face as she spotted Christopher quietly playing with a small truck in my kitchen. Her voice was filled with concern as she asked me what was going on, why Christopher was here, and if Jason was around too. I looked at Hannah, my face serious, and explained everything that had happened. Jason was gone, I told her. He'd abandoned Christopher and left without saying where he was going. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my words as I revealed that Jason had reported our restaurant, leading to its closure. My heart ached as I watched Christopher sitting nearby, playing to distract himself. I could see the fear and anxiety in his eyes, occasionally brimming with tears. When Christopher whispered that his father hadn't been kind to him, his voice small and frightened, I felt a surge of protectiveness. I crouched beside him, forcing a comforting smile onto my face. I promised him he was safe now, that I would protect him and never let his father treat him that way again. My voice was filled with a mixture of tenderness and determination. Hannah was moved by the story and Christopher's condition. She suggested we gather evidence against Jason, insisting his actions were unforgivable, especially towards Christopher. But I shook my head, a look of dark resignation on my face. I reminded her of what Carolyn had said: everything had happened under my supervision. As much as I hated to admit it, I bore some responsibility too. We needed to focus on moving forward, not dwelling on the past. Hannah looked confused and worried as she asked about our future plans. With the restaurant gone, what would we do for income? What were we going to do next? I could tell she was trying not to pressure me, but the impact of the restaurant's closure on our staff was significant. After a moment of silent contemplation, a new determination sparked in my eyes. I turned to Hannah, emotion thick in my voice, and told her she wasn't just my best employee, but a true friend. I suggested we start something new together, a cafe. Something more modest, more careful. We'd hire only trustworthy people, keep prices fair and affordable, and create a much cozier place than our old restaurant. Hannah's eyes widened as she heard my idea. She thought it was wonderful, but had one condition. Looking at Christopher with a gentle smile, she suggested we use part of our profits to help abandoned children and young people on the streets, ensuring they could have proper meals. Without hesitation, I agreed, my smile growing wider. I told Hannah it was a brilliant idea and that we should make it our goal. After Jason's greed had destroyed everything, we needed to contribute to society in some way. As we stood up and embraced, Christopher joining us, I felt a warmth envelop us, a moment of shared hope and purpose. This new cafe idea wasn't just a fresh start for Hannah and me, but a promise of a better future for Christopher and many others in need. It was a testament that even after hardship, we could build something good and meaningful together.
Meanwhile, Jason had arrived in a new city, armed with a plan and the money he'd gotten from ending his partnership with his sister Aaliyah. He quickly decided to open a cafe, renting a commercial space in a bustling downtown area. Confident he could do everything himself, Jason aimed to keep costs to a minimum. For the first few days, Jason was busy renovating the shop. He painted the walls himself, bought second-hand equipment, and chose cheap ingredients for the menu. He thought this was all he needed, wondering who needed employees when he could do everything himself. Jason ignored the lessons he should have learned from the problems at his sister's restaurant. When the cafe opened for business, Jason quickly realized he was overworked. With no employees, he struggled to maintain quick and efficient service. He muttered irritably about customers not understanding the value of cheap service and being too demanding, as complaints about the food and wait times became frequent. The poor quality of the cheap ingredients soon became apparent, with dry hamburgers, soggy French fries, and watery drinks becoming the norm. The few customers they had gradually disappeared. Jason tried to reassure himself, thinking it was just a matter of time. He believed everyone would come back once they realized the value of low prices, convinced they couldn't find cheaper prices anywhere else. He continued to ignore his failures. As weeks passed, costs kept piling up. The store rent, maintenance costs for aging equipment, and high bills constantly reminded Jason that his cost-cutting strategy was failing. Jason lamented, wondering why this was happening when he had cut costs everywhere, unwilling to acknowledge that his self-centered thinking was the root of his problems. One day, an exhausted Jason sat in front of his empty cafe after work, staring at the nearly deserted street. He reflected on his journey, feeling a mix of frustration and anger. He kept repeating the same thoughts as before, believing he should succeed and had the right to success, but not realizing how his self-centered actions and decisions had led to his failure. His reflection wasn't true regret, just a bitter realization that he might have gone too far this time. Jason had driven himself to failure by trying to do everything alone and cutting costs as much as possible.
After the tumultuous months of transitioning from our failed restaurant to a new cafe, Hannah and I were working tirelessly to make our new venture a success. We named our creation a community cafe, and it quickly became a warm gathering place for the neighborhood. I felt a surge of pride every time I looked around our cafe, seeing how it stood out not just for its excellent coffee and homemade snacks, but for its strong commitment to social responsibility. In those first 8 weeks, Hannah and I poured our hearts into shaping the cafe into a place that reflected quality, affordability, and care for the community. Our decor was simple yet cozy, a far cry from the upscale restaurant we once ran. Local artists' work adorned the walls, and repurposed wooden furniture added a rustic charm. We didn't spend a fortune, but every corner felt like home. I found myself not just an owner now, but also a surrogate mother to Christopher. Managing the cafe with a firm but gentle hand, I watched Christopher blossom in his new environment. Since the incident with Jason, he'd been living with me, truly becoming part of this new family we'd created. My heart swelled every time I saw him helping with small tasks like setting tables or bringing water to customers, his face beaming with the joy of being useful. "I'm so happy to be here, Aunt Aaliyah," he'd often say, and I'd have to blink back tears of my own. Hannah took charge of the kitchen management and supplier relationships, ensuring every product we used was high quality and ethically sourced. She also spearheaded a project to provide meals for street children, which quickly became the heart of our community cafe. Every day, for the hour before closing, we'd open our doors to homeless children and young people, offering them nutritious meals free of charge. "The food we serve is made with heart. This is our way," Hannah would proudly explain to anyone who asked about the project. One afternoon, as I was arranging flowers on the tables for the next day, the cafe door opened and a familiar figure walked in. It was Jason, looking more worn out than I'd ever seen him. As he looked around, clearly surprised by the changes, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. I steadied my voice, not hiding my wariness as I asked him what he was doing here. I reminded him that he wasn't invited, especially after what he'd done, disappearing and abandoning his own son. Jason's eyes were unreadable, but there was a faint smile on his lips as he replied. He said he'd come to see how things had turned out, admitting that we seemed to have bounced back well and that the place wasn't bad. His voice was tinged with curiosity and a hint of regret. I studied him for a moment, carefully choosing my next words. I looked Jason in the eye and told him I knew he had reported the restaurant. The truth always comes out, I said, not accusingly, but matter-of-factly. I could see Jason swallow hard, processing my words. He clearly hadn't expected me to know about his betrayal, let alone see me succeeding despite his interference. After a moment's hesitation, he awkwardly apologized, but his voice lacked sincerity and he couldn't meet my gaze. I looked at him with a calm but determined expression. I told him I no longer harbored resentment, that I had let go of that burden. But I made it clear that this didn't mean he was welcome here. My voice was quiet but firm as I pointed out his failure to treat even his own son decently, saying he had neither pride nor honor. Jason reacted violently, his face contorting with anger. He accused me of taking everything from him, his son, his income, his life. He said that I, his own sister, had destroyed him and stood by watching it happen. I took a deep breath, feeling a quiet strength as I responded. I told him he was wrong, that he had destroyed himself. These were the consequences of his own choices. I added that Christopher was happier now, and that was what truly mattered. At those final words, Jason left the cafe, defeat evident in his steps. As he walked away, I heard him mutter that he might not be welcome here, but surely he'd be accepted somewhere else. He seemed to be trying to convince himself that someday, everyone would regret turning their backs on him. In the months that followed, Hannah and I continued to thrive at his community cafe. Our little place became beloved in the neighborhood, known for its quality products and strong commitment to social contribution. Christopher flourished in our loving, supportive environment, often helping at the counter or with community projects, learning the value of work and generosity. Meanwhile, Jason found a modest path selling homemade cookies to drivers at traffic lights. Over time, he began to understand that quality was more important than quantity, as no one wanted to buy his cookies until they were properly made. His life was harder than he had imagined, but he was slowly learning the importance of care and respect for quality. Still, his greed kept him living a modest life. And so, we each found our way, learning from life's challenges and adapting. Hannah and I continued our business and personal lives with gratitude and purpose, while Jason, through a more difficult and lonely path, was slowly beginning to understand the lessons life was trying to teach him. Our story ended with individual growth and new beginnings, each of us forever changed by the journey we had taken.
If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is crucial for us to continue delivering inspiring stories regularly. Don't miss our next surprising tale. We sincerely appreciate your support. Until next time, take care.